Welcome to another episode of the Chronic Comeback podcast. Today is a bit of a special show, and we've got someone on the show that I know you all will have heard of. We've got Annie Hopper, founder of Dynamic Neural Retraining System, or DNRS, as you all will know it. So Annie actually developed DNRS in 2008 after herself achieving a full recovery from unexplained illnesses by implementing her own daily program of brain-based rehabilitation, which focused on rewiring faulty neural pathways in the brain. Since then, the DNRS program has been recommended by doctors worldwide, and actually by my doctor was recommended me as well, and has helped thousands of others retrain the brain to regulate maladapted stress response and recover from an impressive variety of mysterious chronic symptoms and syndromes. I am super excited to have you on the show, Annie. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Phil. Thanks so much for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So like with a lot of people who start these things, they're born out of a personal struggle, which was definitely the case with yourself. Could you tell us a little bit about that story, like how that began and how that kind of led you into DNRS?
Yeah, sure. I think it might be helpful to go back to what I was doing at the time when I got sick. So at the time I was working as a core belief counselor in Kelowna, British Columbia, and I was also a journalist. So I was 40 years old. I was super healthy, super happy. And as a core belief counselor, I would help people look at limiting core beliefs that might be preventing them from accessing joy, love, or success in their life. And I really did a lot of work around relationships, and specifically looking at how your emotional reality as a child might be showing up as your physical reality as an adult. It was great work. I loved it. I wrote a newspaper column for 10 years called Emotional Rescue, where I'd help people navigate their emotional terrain and how to really start to look at patterns that might be leading to belief systems and outcomes in their life and how to change those patterns. So I was very well versed at looking for patterns and changing patterns. And then I moved into an office building for my counseling practice, and the office was an older building. And unbeknownst to me, there was mold in the building. And also, I moved into what was formerly a part of the janitor supply room that they just put up an extra wall and said, let's make a new office out of this place. So I actually didn't have proper ventilation in my office, and I shared a wall with the janitor supply room where they held all the heavy industrial cleaners for the building. So I was exposed to toxic mold. I was exposed to a lot of industrial toxic cleaners on a daily basis, and that was for about 5 months. So it was kind of funny when I look at it now. And when I went in, I painted it 2 coats of my favorite color, green, and bought all new furniture and created this healing oasis, which turned out to be a toxic pit. But yeah, I was there for about 5 months. And over that 5 months, I started to develop some very interesting symptoms. Now, there are 2 things that I'd like to talk about. One is the symptoms, but let's talk about the perfect storm that happened. So part of the perfect storm is definitely moving into that office. That was I'm looking at toxic traumas. What were the toxic traumas that were part of my perfect storm? So definitely moving into a building that had mold, being exposed to all those industrial chemical cleaners, being exposed to volatile organic compounds from all the new furniture and the paint. But also prior to that, there was a fire in the city where I lived. A few months before that, where I was exposed to wild smoke fire on a daily basis for quite a few weeks. And then if I look back even further, about 6 months before that, I was in a car accident where I had a neck injury. And although the impact of the car accident wasn't that bad, it was probably about the 4th car accident I'd been in my lifetime. But it left me with a cervical kind of shake in my neck, like Parkinson's. It almost looked like Parkinson's. So I had a really serious neck injury at that time. And if I look back even further into what could have caused, this limbic injury for me, I also had a history of childhood trauma. My father was an alcoholic, and certainly that's not the only reason why you would develop limbic system impairment. But, when you're looking at the limbic system is the part of the brain that is about survival and threat and protection, then certainly having an alcoholic parent might make the fear or survival centers of my brain fire a little bit more rapidly. So it wasn't actually until I had that exposure to mold and renting the office that I really started to develop some very strange symptoms. So it started off as kind of like general headaches, and then it went into chronic joint pain and muscle pain. And then I had constant muscle twitching. I was suffering from insomnia and anxiety, but the weirdest symptom was that my sense of smell was increasing, but I didn't really recognize it at the time. I just thought that everything else smelled different. And one of my favorite sayings at the time was, "Can't you smell that? That stinks." Like, I just could not believe that people couldn't smell the same thing that I could smell. It was just unbelievable to me. So, my sense of smell started to increase. And, when I was exposed to perfume, or somebody who's wearing cologne or really heavy scented products, first it started off as getting like instant, really bad headaches. But then the symptoms started to really become disabling, to the point where if I was exposed at all, I would immediately lose my voice. I might go into central nervous convulsions. I mean, totally disabled, and be out for days. It would take me days to recover from something like that. So you can imagine that, it became really hard to navigate my world, because I was always trying to figure out, where can I go in the world without being exposed to these things that are absolutely disabling me. So I became, as a result of that, you can imagine, I became really, really isolated. I researched a lot about chemicals and the products that we're in, and about, what could be causing the symptoms, because I just found out a wealth of knowledge about the chemicals in our everyday life and how that could be actually causing disease or part of the symptoms. So I really started to become an environmental advocate, really looking at what's in the products that we use, what I put in my body, all of that stuff. Yet, despite living a perfectly clean life, I was remaining sick and was getting worse. So I knew from the very beginning that, well, actually, I didn't know from the very beginning, but I knew when I started to have convulsions and stuff like that, I'm like, there's obviously something wrong with the way that my brain is processing information, because that just doesn't make sense. So it didn't make sense to me that somebody else could walk down the detergent aisle and be fine with that. And yet I would go into central nervous system convulsions. I'm like, there's definitely something wrong with the way that my brain is filtering and interpreting sensory information. So anyway, back to the story. So I'll just tell you when things got really worse, when things went from bad to worse. So about a year and a half after having very severe chemical sensitivities, I developed electric hypersensitivity syndrome. Now, at this point, I'd already been diagnosed with MCS, or multiple chemical sensitivities. I already had fibromyalgia. I was experiencing anxiety, situational depression, a lot of other things, and now add to that EMF sensitivities. So what that meant for me is that I became sensitive to things like cell phones or wireless or appliances, which you can imagine is like entering a world of science fiction. That's the only way to describe it. And what it also meant was that I could no longer live in my own home. And you can imagine I was pretty distraught. I didn't know what was happening. And the only thing that I could do at the time was get away from everything. And so I went camping, and then I ended up living on a broken down houseboat for a while. And I just have to say, I'm not the camping kind of girl. and that's not it's not my natural thing to go camping. But, it's interesting when and I know you know this, Phil, when you have situations in life like this, you don't know how strong you are until you're faced with a situation like this. And you don't know how strong the will to survive is until you're in a situation like this. So that's kind of when I hit rock bottom. It was when I developed EMF sensitivities. And, just like everybody else, I've been to see like a million health practitioners along the way to see what was wrong. And I've been diagnosed with a million different things, like, heavy metal toxicity and, a number of other things. And I tried a lot of different mainstream treatments, alternative treatments, just everything that anything that anybody recommended, I would try. And I was an obedient patient. Like, I would do things till the cows came home, and I detoxed my way to Mars and back. And yet I was still sick. So I'm like, there has to be something else happening. So yeah, that's where I'll stop the story. There has to be something else happening.
Yeah. How were you dealing with that? Like mentally, how was like, and also like socially, did that like impact your social life, like your relationships that you had around you? Did people get what was going on?
Oh, that's a really great question. Well, mentally, it was very challenging because I was alone most of the time. Actually, my dog was with me when I was living on the houseboat. So that was, she was a lifesaver for me. But mentally, it was really, really hard because not only was I alone, but my thought process had changed entirely. And I recognized it. I mean, what I said before, as a core belief counselor, I was used to looking at patterns, thought patterns, emotional patterns, behavioral patterns, and my thought patterns were not good. And part of it I could understand because situationally, I was in this awful situation where I was isolated from everyone and everything that I loved in my life. But also, I recognized that I had really intrusive negative thoughts, and I became curious about them. At first, being in a counseling background, I was like, well, if I'm having this feeling come up and I'm having these thought processes, then I should allow them to be and investigate them if I need to, and do some of the work that I used to do, and be able to really reintegrate those into my life, or release them, or what have you, to move forward. But it was funny because what I found was none of the actual processes that I used to do around emotional healing worked when I had limbic system impairment. And that was actually a really key sign that something was wrong with my brain, because I would do all of the emotional work and do all of that stuff. And yet 10 minutes later, it was like a gerbil on a treadmill. 10 minutes later, my brain was recycling the same pattern again. I'm like, whoa, what's happening? I just went through all of this process to let this go, and yet it's coming back again. So I'm like, okay, hang on a second. There's something wrong with the way that my brain is processing, not only processing sensory information, but it's affecting me on a mental and psychological level as well. And emotionally, it was really strange because I would have, it was really interesting. If I had an exposure to chemicals, I would immediately start crying. And it wasn't because I was upset necessarily. It was a pure physiological reaction to an exposure. And I thought that was interesting too. I was like, wow, this is tied in to the emotional center of my brain. And just stepping back and being that curious observer, it was really interesting to see how that was playing out. So, how did it affect my relationships? Oh my goodness. Wow. That's a big question. I think in some ways it was a really interesting weeding out process. And I'll say that in the nicest way, because, I loved these people. They're really great people. But when I had this very strange illness that they couldn't understand, some people in the beginning were really empathetic and tried to support me. But in the end, it became literally impossible because I had so many hoops that they would have to jump through in order just to be with me. It was like, okay, you can't wear this laundry detergent. You can't have any scented chemicals on. And if you come to see me, you can't have your cell phone. You can't have this, that, and the other thing. And I can imagine talking to me would be depressing. Talking to me at that time might be a little bit depressing for anyone, because I was only concerned about one thing, and that was my survival. I'm like, how am I going to get through a day? How am I going to get through the rest of my life if this condition doesn't change? So yeah, it severely affected me. I think that my solace and my hope at that point came from really understanding that there was something wrong with my brain, but also knowing, I guess, my faith my spiritual faith and my reliance on something and my connection to something greater than myself. Although that was tenuous at times too, I have to admit. But yeah, I would do a lot of spiritual practices and just really try to connect with nature as much as I could, and knowing that, even though nobody else seemed to have the answer, that there must be an answer. So yeah, that answers that question. And the relationships. So not only the relationships with my friends and my spiritual community and, my work relationships and, I had to quit working, all of that stuff, but also my relationship with my primary partner, James. And God bless him. He stood with me through this whole thing. And I'm like, amazing. He's a rock. But he knew that I wasn't crazy, and I think that that's a big thing. People kind of think that, oh, this must be in your head, but it's not in your head at all. It's really physical. It's a huge physical illness. Anyway, James stayed with me through the whole thing. And when I was living on the houseboat, the company that he worked for actually allowed him to take a week off every 4 or 5 weeks to come and stay with me. And it was just a blessing. So he stayed with me through the whole thing. And on just a short note about James he was profoundly deaf when we first met. And then a couple of years into our relationship, he actually received a cochlear implant, which allowed him to hear again. So he kind of has his own experience at neuroplasticity in his brain, having to learn how to hear again, but that's an aside story. So yes, it affected all of my relationships. I was very lucky that James stayed with me through this whole thing, and that I continued to have my faith in something bigger than I am.
And so you were clearly kind of on this path of knowing that there was something around kind of interrupting these thoughts, neural pathways, and there was a theory there, but like, how did you start to put that into practice, and how did you actually start to make improvements in your situation?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, I started to do a lot of research on the brain prior to developing electromagnetic sensitivities. So when I had MCS and I was going to all of these specialists and doctors and doing everything that they said, but I wasn't really getting any better, or I would get slightly better and then slingshot right back into a cycle of chronic illness again. So I was like, well, whatever is happening, this might help most people, but it's not helping me. So there was something else going on. And I knew that. So I started to research the area of the brain that was responsible for sense of smell. Like I said, the limbic system. So when I started to study the limbic system, it became really interesting to me, because I was like, wow, this is the area of the brain that's being affected. It's responsible for your filtering billions of bits of emotional and sensory information into two very distinct categories. So it's either threat or no threat. So you can imagine, if this area of your brain is injured in any way, shape, or form, that it can start categorizing non-threatening information as threatening. They also started looking at a number of areas of the limbic system, like the amygdala. The amygdala is our fear center. Well, the amygdala is actually involved in all emotions, but it's particularly good at detecting threat, and it's involved with survival and or reproduction, actually, of the species. And then I started looking at the hippocampus, which is the area of the brain that's responsible for memory. And in this case, with limbic system impairment, it's actually involved in remembering trauma for future protection. And also the area of the brain, the hypothalamus, which is like our internal chemist, which is really the part of the brain that's releasing hormones and chemicals at any time to try to maintain that state of homeostasis, or to prepare us to flee from danger, to fight, to flee, or to freeze. You can also freeze as a response to that. And also looking at the cingulate cortex, which is the area of the brain that's responsible for where we focus our attention at any time. So, I started experimenting with myself, but I think that the basis of one of the bigger catalysts was looking at the work of Dr. Norman Doidge. And he was the author, or he is the author of The Brain That Changes Itself and The Brain's Way of Healing. And when I read The Brain That Changes Itself, it was just such an aha moment for me, because I realized that, I could be having all of these symptoms because I have a rogue threat mechanism in my brain that is just, not working functionally. And it could be at the center of what's going on, not only through my thought processes, my emotional responses, but also my sensory perception. So, Norman Doidge talks about neuroplasticity, which basically is the brain's ability to change. So what I recognized for myself is that my brain had changed through trauma. And was it possible to reverse those changes? And by reversing those changes, would that end up in, affecting my symptoms at all? So through a process of trial and error, I was able to change the limbic system, and also notice that my sense of smell started to change. And that was probably my first indication that things were changing. My sense of smell started to change. And I thought, nothing else out of all the treatments that I did, everything that I tried, nothing else was actually really making an impact on my sense of smell. So I knew I was headed in the right direction when that happened. And I just continued and continued to get better as a result of that. So really recognizing that the limbic system was a part of the problem, that neuroplastic changes had happened in the brain due to toxic trauma. And the way out of this particular case for me was to self-direct neuroplastic changes in the limbic system in a very accurate way, in a step-by-step process that allowed the limbic system to actually stand down, to go back to reset itself, so that it wasn't in this hyper reactive state anymore.
And at what point, how did things really speed up for you then? And how long did it take you to a point where you were like, okay, I feel like I've got my life back?
It took me about 6 months. Changes started to happen for me within a couple of days, but then, it took consistent effort and work for about 6 months before I felt like, yeah, I'm better. And really at the time, I felt like I'm better. I can do anything. And I realized afterwards that, as time went on, I continued to actually get stronger. So that was surprising. It was like I could now do everything in my life that I could do, but I continue to get stronger. Even I would say I was able to create a set point that was even stronger than prior to all of the toxic trauma. So I think it's like a fine wine. It just gets better and better the more you practice. So it took me about 6 months to, I would say, fully recover, and then just continued to get stronger after that. And it just made sense to me that it was my brain. And I think because nothing else actually changed symptoms in that way, it was really evident to me that my brain was part of the problem, and that even though detoxing and all of that stuff is really good for you, that it wasn't really addressing what needed to be addressed, which was brain function.
And how did you then get into what you're doing now? Essentially, was it kind of a natural progression for you to move straight into actually forming DNRS as an actual process for other people? How quickly did that happen? And could you talk us through that?
Yeah, that probably took about a year to develop. It was natural for me because of my former life prior to getting sick. I was already teaching programs. I developed a lot of programs. I was already teaching. So that part for me was just a natural fit for me. I would say it probably took about a year before I released, started teaching, and then in 2011 created the 14-hour instructional online program, and then wrote the book Wired for Healing, Remapping the Brain to Recover from Chronic and Mysterious Illnesses in 2014. Then released another follow-up online program called A Deeper Dive. That was a couple of years ago now. And we're working on an updated program right now. So I don't know when it'll be released. So I don't want to say dates because I've always been, I can be incorrect in my perception of time, and I don't want to say anything about the release date, but it's coming. So, no, it wasn't that difficult for me to develop the program once I knew what the basics were and what I needed to teach. But I think there were some misconceptions along the way that people have. And there are 5 pillars that we really teach in the program that we focus on. And it's a matter of doing all of these 5 pillars on a daily basis so that people will get results or see results. And the first pillar is really to recognize the link between your condition and brain function, because that will create a mindset that really introduces a new way of thinking about how brain function might be involved in your condition. And the second pillar is called interrupting and redirecting pathways of the past. And that is, this pillar focuses on how to interrupt old neural pathways to keep the brain in a state of survival and learn to redirect thought, emotional, and behaviors to create new positive neural pathways. And so that's just a pillar number 2, really looking at your thought patterns, emotional patterns, and behavioral patterns, and really recognizing what patterns are associated with limbic system impairment and how you can, really focus on something else that's going to support strengthening alternative neural pathways. And pillar 3 of the program is practicing full rounds of the DNRS retraining steps. And the steps utilize a variety of methods that involve speech, movement, visualization, and thought and emotional restructuring. And the intention of this step is to really decrease firing of the threat mechanism in the brain while elevating your emotional state and sustaining the brain's focus. Sometimes people find that they put too much focus on just the steps themselves and they're not doing all the rest of the program. And sometimes when people do the steps, they find an immediate change in symptoms right away, but that's not the actual intention of the program. The intention of the program is to really develop or strengthen new neural pathways in the brain. And that can take some time. So people might see changes within a few days, they might see changes within a few weeks, they might see changes in months. But what I really like to focus on is don't just look for physical changes, really look for subtle changes in thought patterns and in emotional patterns and behaviors as well. Because I think when we're in these chronic illness cycles, we're really focused on our physical symptoms and really wanting to see changes in those physical symptoms. And they will change in time when those new neural pathways are strong enough. But to really start keeping track of what your thought processes are like and how you're changing your emotional processes too, or your emotional set point is changing. So anyway, going on to the fourth pillar is incremental training. And basically, incremental training involves changing trauma and fear associations along with guided exposure therapy. And this can be imaginary or real, and it's always done with that kind of basis of environmental awareness in mind, knowing what we know. We're going to do that in a safe and informed way. So incremental training will definitely help your brain desensitize from whatever it is that you might be reacting to, whether that is, whether it's a sensory stimuli, or it could be energy output, or it could be a whole bunch, a list of different symptoms. And the fifth pillar of recovery is to elevate your emotional state. And by elevating your emotional state, it helps to provide a cue of safety to the brain, allowing for the brain to move out of survival related emotions and pave the way for positive neuroplastic change. So, it's interesting because elevating your emotional state is not actually needed for survival. So it kind of seems a little bit counterproductive or counterintuitive to elevate your emotional state when you're suffering from chronic illness, but it actually is pivotal for moving your brain out of that threat response. So again, that's the fifth pillar of recovery. So I always say that rewiring your limbic system is like learning to drive a car or learning how to ride a bike at first. It can seem like there's a lot of complex different things to track or to navigate at one time, but it becomes easier with practice. So, once you find your sense of balance, it's a lot easier to ride a bike. So it does get easier over time. At first, it can seem a little bit complex, but once you get the hang of it, you get into the swing of it, it becomes really easy.
Perfect. And you've been doing this for some time now, and I feel like I've listened to a lot of, probably so many more recovery stories than the normal person going through chronic illness would do. But you must have heard so many recovery stories. Are there any recovery stories for you that really stand out that you might share with us that would be particularly maybe inspiring to people listening?
Yeah, sure. I think that a couple of stories that stand out, of course, there are thousands. Like, I can't even count. We have over 13,000 people, I think, on our global community forum, which is an online platform for people that are doing the program and sharing their success stories or asking peers questions about the program. And that's just a small percentage of people that have gone through the program. So I can't keep track of the people that have recovered. But what I can tell you is the backdrop of my life on a daily basis is witnessing what other people would consider medical miracles. And it's not a miracle once you understand neuroplasticity and how to apply it. So yeah, there are just so many, it's hard to pick some, but I think two of the, and we have lots on our website. So if people are looking, they can just go under success stories on our website. But a couple of the more recent ones I'd like to talk about are actually from two doctors. So I find it interesting because, you know, people that are in the medical field or you're really schooled in something, it's hard to kind of be open sometimes to new ideas. But these people were suffering, so like just suffering so much that they were willing to be open to a new idea. And I think it made sense to them once they started looking at the program. So one was Sandra, and she had long COVID. And I think that, yeah, this was interesting. So she part of her long COVID symptoms, she had severe cognitive decline. And I'm going to read some notes by this because I couldn't remember her story. I can barely remember my own story, so I wouldn't be able to remember hers. But anyways, she forgot how to write and could not remember what letters looked like or how to shape them with a pen. She had postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, mast cell activation system. She had headaches, vision issues, gut issues, brain fog, fatigue and weakness. She was confined to a wheelchair most of the time and could barely move. She had sensitivities to light, to sound, and severe chemical sensitivities. She had severe food sensitivities. She was down to 6 foods. She had numbness in her hands and face and insomnia and also blood pressure issues. And I think the worst part of that is, you know, Sandra had a daughter who was 6 years old, I think at the time, and she could no longer care for herself or her daughter. So they had to move in with her parents, and her parents became, you know, her daughter's full-time caregivers. So her parents were also taking care of Sandra. And within implementing the DNRS program, she heard about the program through a doctor in Sweden who is familiar with our program and recommended that Sandra do the program, and she fully recovered from all of her long COVID symptoms within a few months. Wow. So she's back at work full time, leading a full, healthy life. She's taking care of her daughter, taking care of herself, doing, you know, just everything in life again. So I'm really happy for Sandra and her daughter and for everyone in her life. My second favorite story is another doctor from Australia, and Liz has suffered from a number of limbic system impairment related conditions over 10 years. And with implementing DNRS on a regular basis, she was able to rewire her limbic system and regulate her autonomic nervous system, and recovered fully from multiple chemical sensitivity, mast cell activation syndrome, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, tinnitus, brain fog and cognitive issues, gastrointestinal issues like IBS and reflux and food intolerances. She had an overactive bladder that's completely gone away. She had chronic pain and kind of diffuse pain on a daily basis. She also had cold sensitivities for years, and light sensitivities and noise sensitivities and chemical sensitivities. She had anxiety and sleep disturbances as well. And she's fully recovered from those as well. So, and I think a point that Liz made, she's in our success stories as well. And she made a point of going on our global community forum every day for support and to witness how people were recovering and what they were doing and reporting their successes. And you know, she really accessed all of the support that we have available too. So she was on our global community forum. She also accessed individual coaching that we offer with our certified DNRS coaches. So all of our certified DNRS coaches have recovered from chronic illness through the DNRS program, and they're very well versed in the program and any form of limbic system impairment. And they can help you really tailor the program to your specific needs and guide you through your blind spots, or help you practice in the most efficient ways, and make sure that you're implementing all of the pillars and how you're doing that. And they're great guides in your recovery journey. Also, we have share laugh classes, which are, classes that will help you elevate your emotional state. And so we have lots of support services available. We also have living DNRS classes, which are groups of 24 people on Zoom that are led by one of our certified instructors. And it's a 12-week support group for really implementing DNRS in your life. And, people are also finding those classes invaluable in the recovery process as well. So it's not just the actual program itself, but we have a lot of support services for people as well.
Awesome. And you mentioned earlier, you had issues with mold, chemical sensitivities. Do you think it's possible for people to recover whilst living in, maybe not like, black mold on the wall, but living in a moldy environment with chemicals, and whilst doing your program? Is it possible to recover whilst being in that kind of environment?
Yeah, I do think it's possible to recover in that environment. And because I've known people have recovered in that environment. So, is it possible? Yes. Is it ideal? Probably not. But can you? Yeah. And, I think that it would really depend on the levels, right? But knowing that, it's interesting because I think when your limbic system is impaired and you pick up on the smallest amount of anything as if it is potentially life-threatening. And yet it's not potentially life-threatening for other people. So, one person in a family could get mold illness, but everybody else is fine. And they're living in the same house. So, is it possible? Yes. Is it ideal? No, but it's possible. And like you said, of course you wouldn't want to do that with, mold everywhere or whatever, but I think it is possible. And I think it's also, the reverse idea is looking at, can we create the perfect environment for healing? And I tried, God knows I tried. And there is never a perfect environment for healing. And, we know people that have moved out to the desert because they're trying to find the perfect environment for healing and it doesn't work. So I don't think that avoidance is the answer. I think that retraining the brain is a big part of the answer. Again, doesn't mean that I throw my environmental awareness hat out the window, but we want to really make sure that we're looking at that through a balanced perspective, which is the brain is involved, and if you can change your brain changes everything.
What would you say is the biggest limiting factor with people who don't do well with your program? What would you say is kind of like the main, I guess, commonality you see in people's personalities or the way they approach the program?
I would say, it's hard to say because I don't really know for sure, but I would probably say my best guess is consistency, right? Like forming any habit, we have to be consistent with retraining our brain. So I think it's the consistency and motivation. And that's why we have so many support services available, because I'm like, I don't want anybody to fall through the cracks, right? Like, we have the support systems in place. Please reach out and, be a part of our support systems, because I think that people, when you have limbic system impairment, it's really isolating and we get used to doing things alone because we've had to, but you don't have to do this alone. And there are so many ways that you can reach out to support to maintain that motivation and really get clarity on how to do the program and support as you go along. So yeah, I would say motivation and consistency are probably the biggest things.
And you mentioned long COVID before. We actually haven't had anyone on the show, maybe because it's, yes, a newer thing that people are going through. But I have had a few people reach out to me who were suffering with it and kind of didn't really know where to go with it. And I did point them towards brain retraining. But how is your understanding of that grown? Is your approach any different with something like that? And could you maybe just tell us, the impact that maybe your program is having on people with that?
Yeah, for sure. Well, like Sandra's story that I talked about in the beginning, it's been profoundly effective for people with long COVID. And not to say that we're going to be able to change like organ damage that has happened. There are limitations within brain retraining and resetting your nervous system and your autonomic nervous system and, reversing that maladaptive stress response. There are certainly limitations in that. But, a lot of people, what's happened is, with long COVID, their body and their brain has done their best on their immune system. Their immune system has fought the virus as well as it possibly could, but sometimes the immune system actually gets stuck itself in this fighting response, and the brain and the immune system are stuck in this fight, flight, or freeze response. So, if we can get people out of that response, then their body has the ability their nervous system has the ability to reset. And a lot of symptoms that they have as long COVID patients actually start to resolve. So, it's interesting that a lot of the ongoing chronic symptoms that long COVID patients are experiencing are the same as people with chronic fatigue syndrome, with postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, with chemical sensitivities, with depression, and a variety of other limbic system related conditions. So there's a lot of overlap there. So what we're seeing is that when people reset their limbic system, that a lot of the symptoms go away, and it's been completely life transforming for them. There's a couple of studies that we're involved in. One is research from the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. They're conducting a retrospective study on the effectiveness of the Dynamic Neural Retraining System, DNRS, on patients with severe symptoms of long COVID and POTS, or postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. And the early findings are suggesting really, really great results. The other study is the University of Alberta in Canada will be conducting a clinical trial on the DNRS program to measure improvements in health-related quality of life in people with long COVID and chronic fatigue. So we're really hopeful that both of these studies will move forward in good time. As we know, obviously, not only are people suffering from all of these other illnesses, but now millions of people are suffering from long COVID. And we want them to have answers sooner rather than later. So those are the studies that are happening.
Awesome. And I guess just another question. Someone's actually asked this question from our audience, and I think it's quite an interesting one. How would someone tell the difference, in your opinion, between symptoms of limbic system dysfunction and real triggers? So, for an example, like if I'm in a place with like a musty smell and I start to feel sick, should I just stay there, or like carry on with my practices and kind of try to interrupt my thoughts? Because I guess if you mentioned avoidance, then I guess, would it be almost playing into that fight or flight if you were to leave and to escape?
I think I'd like to talk about incremental training in that aspect. We really look at incremental training on areas of sensitivities and looking at how you can incrementally train to work your way up to environments that you might be reactive to, but not as I'm in this space, I have to stay here because if I'm avoiding it, it's not good. It's like, okay, hang on a second. Maybe your brain pathways aren't strong enough yet. Maybe you have to do a little bit more practice and introduce this in a gradual way for your brain not to have that response to that stimuli. So I think ideally incremental training would probably be a better way to approach that. Although for some people, they don't have the ability to incrementally train. So for example, they're experiencing 24/7 pain. Right. Well, you don't really get the chance to incrementally train on 24/7 pain, but you train anyway. You would bring that consciously to mind every once in a while and do the practices around that. But also, making sure that you're applying all pillars of recovery, not just that change my thoughts, right? Because it's not changing your thoughts is one aspect of it, but it's not everything. I think you really have to understand strengthening neural pathways to the point where your immune system isn't reacting anymore to that stimulus and your brain isn't reacting to that stimulus as it was. So it's kind of it's an interesting question, because I think it reminds me of clients that say, I've pushed my way through things, right? I've pushed my way through things and then I've crashed, or I've pushed my way through experiences where I was exposed and I knew that I would get sick and then I crashed. Well, it's not about pushing your way through something. It's actually about training your way through something. And there's a very, very distinct difference between pushing your way through something and really training your way up to something. So I would really look at incremental training in that respect.
That's a great answer.
Mhm.
And you've got a unique perspective of someone who's been through this, and now you're teaching people, or you've developed a program that is helping so many other people that are going through this. What would you say to someone who's listening to this right now, who is going through, one of their worst days? You mentioned rock bottom earlier. They're at rock bottom and they're listening to this, but they really can't see for themselves. They're a bit different. There's something different about their story. They won't recover. What would you say to someone who's thinking those thoughts to really kind of help them cultivate that belief?
First of all, they're not alone. I think that that's important to understand, is that you're not alone, and people have been in the position that you're in, maybe not the exact situation. And I think that's one of the things with limbic system impairment, is that we feel, because it's such a critical illness in some ways, that we feel like nobody else can understand the suffering. So one is, you're not alone, and you are more resilient than you think you are. And you're more courageous than most people in the world. It takes a lot of energy and effort to continuously approach another day when you're suffering from a complex chronic illness. So I would say you're courageous, you're not alone, and your suffering could be the catalyst to great change in the world. And you just don't know that yet. I'm reminded of a saying from The Wizard of Oz, when I think it's Glenda the Good Witch says to Dorothy, "You've always had the power, my dear. You just had to learn it for yourself." So I think there are tools and ways, there are treatments, there are modalities out there that work for people, and it can work for you too. And just keep having faith. Don't lose hope. You're more resilient than you think, and you're stronger than you think.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think that's a powerful point to draw the podcast to a close. In terms of, I'm sure a lot of people listening to this have already heard of DNRS, but if they don't know how to access the program itself, how would they do that?
Yeah, just go to our website. It's retrainingthebrain.com. All of our products are on the website. They can also do a self-assessment questionnaire. If they think that they have limbic system impairment, then there's a self-assessment questionnaire on our website. Also, they can buy the program online. They can sign up for support services. They can sign up for the community forum. Once they've purchased the program, they'll have automatic access to our global community forum. They can sign up for additional optional classes of living DNRS, or one-on-one coaching, or share laugh classes. It's all available to them.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sparing the time, Annie. I know you're very busy, so really appreciate it. And I know all of our listeners will have got a lot from this. So thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me, Phil. It was great to see you.